Somewhere in your bathroom right now, there's a bar of soap or a bottle of something foaming, sitting there so unremarkably that you've probably never once thought about what it actually is or why it works. That object represents one of the oldest continuously used chemical formulas in human history. One so old that the exact same basic recipe was already written down on clay tablets before the pyramids at Giza were finished. And one that, for a genuinely alarming stretch of European history, people actively believed could kill you. So here's the real question. When did humans first figure out how to make something specifically to get clean? And why did it take so long for that idea to actually stick? Because the story of soap isn't a straight line of steady progress. It's full of genuine breakthroughs, centuries of people actively avoiding water out of real fear, and one doctor who got mocked out of his own profession for suggesting something that seems obvious today. Wash your hands. Start with the oldest written evidence we actually have. Archaeologists have recovered clay tablets from ancient Babylon, dating back roughly 4,800 years, that describe a specific process: boiling fat together with wood ash. That combination isn't random. Wood ash contains an alkaline compound, and when you combine an alkaline substance with fat and heat it, you trigger a chemical reaction called saponification, the exact same basic reaction that produces every bar of soap made anywhere on Earth today. The Babylonians almost certainly weren't using this substance primarily to wash their bodies. Evidence suggests it was used mainly for cleaning wool before weaving it into textiles. But the underlying chemistry, fat plus alkali equals something that lifts grease and dirt away from a surface, was already understood and deliberately reproduced nearly 5,000 years ago, recorded carefully enough by scribes that we can still read the exact proportions today. A separate Sumerian tablet, roughly this same general era, describes something closer to actual personal hygiene practice, a specific recipe combining ash, cypress oil, and a small amount of the same saponified fat mixture, intended for washing. It's not a leap to call it soap in the modern sense, but it's clearly a deliberate formula, refined and repeated enough that someone considered it worth permanently recording in clay. Ancient Egypt developed its own parallel relationship with cleanliness, and it went considerably further than simple textile processing. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical document dating to roughly 1550 BCE, describes combining animal and vegetable oils with alkaline salts to treat various skin conditions, a formula that functions remarkably similarly to actual soap. Egyptians bathed regularly, a genuinely notable habit for the ancient world, and archaeological evidence shows they used natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt mined from dry lake beds for cleaning, for mummification, and for basic dental care, sometimes mixed with crushed pumice and mint to scrub the teeth directly. Wealthier Egyptians used scented oils and early cosmetic treatments as part of daily hygiene, applied liberally enough that visitors from other regions occasionally commented on it. Cleanliness in ancient Egypt wasn't purely practical either. It carried genuine religious significance, since priests specifically were required to bathe multiple times a day and to remove all body hair from their entire bodies before entering temples, treating physical cleanliness as inseparable from spiritual purity, on the reasoning that nothing unclean could be allowed anywhere near the presence of the gods. Now travel to ancient Rome, because Roman hygiene culture took a genuinely different technical approach, one that might actually surprise you. Despite Rome's massive, genuinely impressive public bathing culture, the enormous thermae complexes that functioned as much as social and political gathering spaces as places to actually get clean, complete with heated floors, cold plunge pools, and rooms specifically designed for different stages of the bathing process, Romans typically didn't use soap to wash their bodies at all. Instead, they covered their skin with oil, then scraped the oil off, along with the dirt and dead skin it had picked up, using a curved metal tool called a strigil. Wealthy Romans often had a slave, called an unctor, whose entire job was applying the oil and handling the scraping. Public baths were a massive part of daily Roman social and civic life, some large enough to hold well over 1,000 bathers at once, but the actual mechanism for getting clean relied on oil and scraping rather than the soap-based lathering method that feels so obvious to us today. Soap specifically, in something closer to the form we'd actually recognize, gets credited by the Roman writer Pliny the Elder to a different group entirely, the Gauls, in what's now France and parts of Germany. Pliny described a substance called sapo, made by combining goat tallow with the ashes of the beech tree. And according to his account, the Gauls used it initially as a kind of pomade for styling and coloring hair, not primarily as something to wash the body with at all. Some etymologists have even proposed that our modern word soap itself may trace back to this Gaulish or Celtic term, though the linguistic history remains genuinely debated among specialists. Either way, this represents an early, mostly independent thread of soap-adjacent technology developing somewhat apart from the Mediterranean bathing culture surrounding it. The next major leap in actual soap-making technology comes from the Islamic Golden Age, and it's genuinely significant because this is where the recognizable modern hard bar of soap essentially takes shape. In the city of Aleppo, in what's now Syria, soap makers developed a sophisticated process combining olive oil with laurel oil, then treating the mixture with an alkaline solution and curing the resulting bars for months at a time, sometimes stacked in towers inside dedicated soap factories with the bars stamped and dated before being shipped along established trade routes. Aleppo soap and the closely related soap-making traditions that developed throughout the wider Islamic world represented a genuine technical leap beyond anything that came before it, a stable, reliably solid, portable bar, rather than a soft, unstable paste that had to be made in comparatively small batches and used up quickly. This knowledge spread through trade routes and through the Crusades, and it directly influenced the later development of Castile soap in Spain, a purely olive oil-based soap that eventually became renowned across Europe for its exceptional mildness and quality, prized specifically because it contained none of the animal fat that made cruder Northern European soaps harsh on skin. Then Europe took a genuinely strange, centuries-long detour, and this is honestly one of the more startling parts of the whole story. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the enormous, sophisticated bathing infrastructure that had defined Roman urban life gradually fell into serious disrepair and disuse. Regular bathing didn't disappear entirely across the whole continent, but it declined sharply and unevenly across large parts of medieval Europe for a tangled mix of reasons. The genuine practical difficulty of heating enough water at scale without Roman-style infrastructure, and, increasingly over time, a set of specific religious and medical beliefs that actively discouraged the practice altogether. That decline reached its most extreme point during the era of the Black Death in the 14th century. Medical thinking at the time was dominated by something called miasma theory, the belief that disease spread primarily through foul-smelling air rather than through direct person-to-person contact or genuinely unsanitary conditions. Under that framework, hot water was believed to open the pores of the skin, and open pores were believed to let dangerous, disease-carrying air seep directly into the body. So across large parts of Plague-era Europe, bathing was actively avoided, out of what people at the time genuinely believed was legitimate medical caution, not simple carelessness or ignorance for its own sake. Some historical accounts, including widely repeated stories about the court of French King Louis XIV roughly 2 centuries later, describe aristocrats relying heavily on perfume specifically to mask body odor rather than bathing to actually eliminate it. A practice that sounds almost unbelievable today, but made a certain grim kind of internal sense within that specific, deeply mistaken medical framework. The real turning point, the one that finally connects cleanliness directly and scientifically to genuine disease prevention, comes from the 1800s, and it centers on one of the more quietly tragic stories in the entire history of medicine. In 1847, a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis, working at a maternity clinic in Vienna, noticed something deeply troubling. Women giving birth in the ward staffed by doctors and medical students were dying of a fever called childbed fever at a rate several times higher than women giving birth in a separate ward staffed only by midwives. Semmelweis eventually traced the difference to one specific factor. Doctors were frequently moving directly from performing autopsies to delivering babies without washing their hands in between. He proposed a simple, direct intervention. Doctors needed to wash their hands with a chlorinated lime solution before examining any patient. It worked, dramatically and immediately. mortality rates in his ward dropped sharply and consistently from close to 18% down to under 2% within a matter of months. And the medical establishment of his own era largely rejected him anyway, ridiculed the idea outright, since germ theory as we understand it today didn't yet exist as an accepted framework, and the suggestion that respected physicians themselves might be personally responsible for spreading deadly infection through their own unwashed hands was seen by many of his own colleagues as a genuine, almost unbearable professional insult. Semmelweis grew increasingly desperate trying to convince his peers, eventually writing angry open letters accusing prominent obstetricians of, in his own words, presiding over a massacre. Semmelweis died in 1865 in an asylum, still largely dismissed by the mainstream medical community of his time. It would take Louis Pasteur's later, independent work establishing germ theory as a broadly accepted scientific framework before Semmelweis's original observation was finally, fully vindicated, decades after his death. From that point forward, once germ theory became firmly established medical consensus, soap stopped being viewed primarily as a simple luxury or a matter of general social politeness. It became understood, correctly and specifically, as one of the single most effective tools ever developed for actively preventing the spread of disease. Industrial manufacturing in the 19th and 20th centuries made soap dramatically cheaper and more widely available than it had ever been at any earlier point in human history. And public health campaigns across the 20th century worked hard to actively popularize regular hand washing as a genuinely serious medical practice, not merely a matter of surface politeness or general good manners. Here's a detail that ties this whole story directly back to your own body right now, sitting here listening to this. Why do humans feel disgust at all? That specific visceral reaction to dirt, to bad smells, to visible grime. Researcher Valerie Curtis at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine has argued that disgust functions as a genuine evolved psychological mechanism specifically for avoiding pathogens, a kind of behavioral immune system running well ahead of and largely independent from any actual scientific understanding of germs or infection. Humans across virtually every studied culture show strikingly similar disgust reactions to broadly the same category of things: bodily waste, decaying matter, visible signs of infection or disease on another person, spoiled food, open wounds. That pattern suggests disgust isn't simply a learned cultural habit passed down and taught explicitly. It's very likely a genuine piece of evolved psychology, one that almost certainly existed and functioned effectively long before anyone, anywhere, had the faintest scientific idea what a pathogen actually was. Curtis's broader research even suggests that specific hygiene behaviors, washing hands, avoiding contact with waste, cleaning wounds, show up independently across cultures with no shared contact whatsoever, in a pattern that should sound familiar by now. A behavior so useful for survival that it kept getting reinvented again and again wherever humans settled. Which means the underlying drive to get clean, to specifically wash away things your body already instinctively recognizes as dangerous or contaminated, may be considerably older than the actual invention of soap itself, in much the same basic pattern that comes up again and again across nearly every deep history topic like this one. The instinct came first. The specific technology to satisfy it more effectively came later, and it arrived through a genuinely long, winding, repeatedly interrupted path. Ash and fat boiled together in ancient Babylon. Oil scraped carefully off with a metal strigil in Rome. Hardened bars cured for months in Aleppo. Centuries of active avoidance driven by a mistaken medical theory in plague-era Europe. And finally, one doctor in Vienna who was right and was punished for it anyway, decades before the rest of the world finally caught up to what he'd already figured out. So, next time you wash your hands without a second thought, you're not just following a simple modern habit. You're the current endpoint of a genuinely tangled 5,000-year story. Ancient chemistry, religious purity codes, deeply mistaken medical theories, and one tragically ignored doctor. All of it quietly compressed into a small bar of soap that you probably don't think about even once during the entire time you're actually using it. So, did any part of this history genuinely surprise you? Tell me honestly in the comments. If stories like this genuinely interest you, hit like. It helps the channel more than you'd probably think. And subscribe if you want more of how deep, strange, and genuinely ancient the ordinary parts of your life actually are.